The first time Bran left the roof that day, the frost had already glossed the slates with a sheen as thin as breath and twice as treacherous. He had learned the roof's one careful step at a time there over the years, as other children learned letters and knots. The tilt of the kitchen loft, the long spine of the great keep, the squat watchtower with its missing crenellation like a broken tooth, the way the wind curled off the godswood and made an eddy by the rookery. The sky was a pale bowl washed with weak sunlight, and the smoke from the chimneys rose straight up before folding over as if the cold had snapped it in two. He crouched on the ridgepole and watched the castle breathe. Down in the yard, men were already at their work. The clang of a hammer drifted up from Micken's forge. He could see, even from here, the pale shapes of raw iron hammered into obedience over the anvil. The kennel-master's boy ran with a pail sloshing, the dogs surging at his heels, and from the mews came the indignant complaints of hawks not yet flown. Beyond the inner walls, beyond the houses and stores, a low mist rested over the hot pools. That mist was Winterfell's own breath, warm as a giant's sigh. Behind him there was a rustle, claws clicking on tile. The wolf pup crept along the ridge after him, ears pricked, nose low, eyes the careful gold of something that has learned to peer around the corner of the world before stepping into it. He came so lightly that Bran felt him more than hurt him, a small warmth at his side. Bran kept one hand on the ridge, turned his head, and grinned. "You shouldn't," he whispered, though there was no one close enough to overhear. "Maester Luwin would scold you worse than me if he found you up here." The pup blinked. He had outgrown some of his cub awkwardness. He moved now with a watchful poise that made Bran think of snow on a branch just before it slides free. A string of names had been tried and abandoned, none of them right. Robb and the others had named their wolves quickly as if the names had been waiting, tucked inside like seeds. His wolf had refused each like a garment that didn't fit. Bran had begun to think the name would come when it pleased, and not before. A far bell rang, thin in the cold air. No one else was about the roofs. Even the Raven Master had stayed inside, coaxing crows with scraps. The royal party had brought too many people for Winterfell to hold comfortably. Tents sprouted like mushrooms against the outer wall. Fires burned in circles, and the king's men laughed too loudly in a place that did not belong to them. Bran had mapped those new paths as well, where the queen's guards patrolled and where they did not, where the perfumed courtiers sneaked to drink or to whisper. There had been a new crate hauled to the old First Keep by Lannister men 3 days ago, heavy enough to make them curse, and they'd stationed a watch there that changed at awkward hours. The First Keep had long been half abandoned, a great round of stone that drank heat and gave back chill. Bran had been inside twice before when stones fell like teeth from the ceiling and the corridors smelled of damp and mouse droppings. He knew how the stairs bent to a narrow window high above the yard. It was good climbing, but the watch made him wary, the way a strange dog's silence does. He rose and felt at once how the frost whispered beneath his boots. Climbing up was one thing, climbing down was something else. He took a breath, and another, and gazed at the sloping tile. "We could go the long way," he told the pup. "Or we could wait for the sun to warm it and then go anywhere." The wolf's breath steamed. Far across the yard, the queen's brother glittered gold and copper in the pale light as he rode through the gates with 2 other men, their laughter drifting up like little sparks on the air, bronzes and ringmail bright as a story. The sound of it tugged at something inside Bran that was less a thought than a tilt. He wanted to be down there among horses and men, to watch the way they lived in their armor as ducks live in water. He wanted to know if their laughter changed when they thought no one saw. He wanted to know everything. Bran put his hands down on the slate and felt the stones cold through his gloves, and decided to go the long way. He showed the wolf how it was done, and the wolf watched, ears turning toward each careful movement. Bran went to the chimney stack of the kitchen where the heat put off from the fires warmed the masonry. He spidered down the rough stones, toes finding purchase where bricks jutted, fingers crimping and shifting. He had done it in snow and with half-numb hands and on days when the wind tried to pluck him free like a burr from wool. He would not be unseated by a skim of frost. At the bottom he dropped the last 2 feet and came down in the angle between chimney and slate, pressed flat a moment with the cold smell of brick and soot in his nose, willing his heart to slow. The wolf came after in a sidling crouch, body close to the stones, and leaped the last little span with a soft clack of claws. When they reached the trapdoor tucked up against the gable end, Bran drew it back with the compass-smooth familiarity of a sailor who knows his ship, and together they slid into the warmth and noise of the kitchens. Heat reached for him in a full embrace. Steam kissed his face. The kitchen was a world of its own, where mothers of the castle stirred cauldrons and children peeled root vegetables at trestle tables, where everything smelled of bread and onion and boiling meat and wet clay. Men slipped through with baskets under their arms. One of the cooks swatted a scullion who had let the yeast froth over. No one remarked on Bran's arrival any more than on the arrival of a cat. He had become part of the numberless traffic of the place, tolerated as carts are tolerated when they stand too long in the passage. "Mind yourself," old Chael grunted as Bra, and slid past. "And keep that beast away from the loaves." "He won't take any," Bran said, as if his saying made it law. The wolf sniffed at the floor where a ladle of fat had splashed earlier and then looked up at Bran with an expression as bland and unshamefaced as any courtier. He snatched a heel of dark bread and a slice of cold cheese that ran a little along the edges, and crammed them together with a piece of apple, a combination only delicious in kitchens at dawn. He half laughed at the mess, wiped the cheese from his thumb onto his jerkin, and pushed back through a door to the passage that led past the scullery and out into the narrow court behind the great hall. The wolf padded beside him, the tip of his tail brushing Bran's leg. Above them, the winter sky had deepened to blue. A raven flapped down to the yard wall with its coarse, harsh croak and peered at Bran with eyes like little chips of coal before hopping away. The yard had filled. Ser Roderick's men were at their drill, forming and reforming, shields going up like shutters. Theon Greyjoy leaned with insouciant ease against a post, smiling at a passing maid. She tossed her hair and pretended not to notice him. Robb, bright and impatient, saw Bran and lifted a hand. Sansa came from the hall in a cloak embroidered with tasteful grace, and Arya ran just behind her like a shadow that had forgotten to touch the ground. Tommen waddled a little under the weight of his own furs, and his brother's pale-haired betrothed looked as if even her frowns would smell of flowers if one were near enough to them. Bran felt the air of the place shift with the kingsmen and their courtiers and the cousins who tacked themselves to the royal family like burrs in the fields. Winterfell held them all because Winterfell had stones that remembered. His father said the castle had been here before histories thought to look for it. The walls knew what to do with strangers. They swallowed and stayed silent. Robb beckoned, and Bran broke into a run. The wolf ran too, hocks flashing. "You were late to your bed," Robb said, grinning. "Mother's looking for you." "I was seeing to the chimneys," Bran said, and Robb laughed aloud. "You and Greekle the sweep." He clapped Bran's shoulder. "Come see. Ser Roderick says we can try the blunted swords today." Bran's heart gave an agreeable leap. "Can I? With Tommen?" He glanced toward the prince, who wrestled an arm free of his cloak and worried his lower lip with his teeth as if the garment might bite back. "Tommen will work with Ser Varley," Robb said. There was nothing cruel in his tone, merely the calm knowledge of outcomes. "And you'll spar with Jory first." "Jory's a grown man," Bran said, but he stood straighter. "The blade's blunted," Robb repeated, patient as a man instructing a colt. "And Jory will hold back. You'll learn the measure of him. That's worth something. The measure of a man." Bran liked that phrase. He liked words he could roll in his mouth like pebbles, testing their edges. The wolf sat and regarded them both. "You stay," Bran told him. "I know what you do when people fight. You bite." The wolf blinked again and, in a small concession, lowered himself to his belly. His chin went to the stone. That pose meant obedience without surrender. Bran couldn't help scratching the soft fur behind one ear, where it grew whiter as it went down into the shadow beneath. Jory came. "So, little lord," he said, his voice roughened from years in the cold and from the dust of the road. "Your brother means to make a swordsman of you." "He means for me to learn," Bran answered, because that was safer than either yes or no. "That's right," Jory agreed. He weighed the sword in his hand, its length hardly more than a long knife. "Stand as Roderick showed you." Bran put his feet as he had been taught, acutely conscious that his hands were too cold and that the sword might clatter out. Jory came on so easy that Bran dared not think of it as an attack. It was like a tide that rose in the night and was already at your ankles when you stepped out in the morning. Bran raised his blade and felt the vibration of their meeting sting along his wrist. Not pain, it was information. He breathed into it and tried again. Jory's sword kissed his without hurting it. They slid and turned. Bran thought for an instant he had him impressed, and the world spun, and Jory's blade looked at his throat with one friendly, unblinking eye. "Good," Jory said, as if the loss were a kind of victory Bran could not yet recognize. Again. He forgot the chill in his fingers. He forgot the noise of men and dogs and the clatter of pails and the drone of the charcoals under the spit. The world was edges and measures and the feel of his own breath. He lost and then once did not. He cut inward and felt Jory's weight yield. The blade slipped and, startled, Bran danced to keep his footing. He saw the moment Jory decided to let go of the exchange and end it, and he felt a flare of shame that he had not won outright but also, confoundingly, pride that he had left a mark in the day. "Good," Robb said, and that was its own warmth against the cold. Sansa had come to watch too, Arya beside her with a smudge of something like charcoal across her cheek. "Your shoulders," Sansa said when Jory had turned away. "You hunch." She mimed a proud carriage, chin up, soft as if she were speaking of posture at her embroidery hoop. "I like my shoulders," Arya said. "The way I move helps me not get hit." "It makes you look scrappy," Sansa returned. "Scrappy's not. Lady?" Theon breathed with false awe toward Sansa and then rolled his eyes at Bran. "You'd think we were in a hall of mirrors with all this talk of shoulder and chin. Come, Starkling, try your hand with something useful." Bran knew Theon's tone too well to mistake his meaning. Nevertheless, he lifted his chin. The last he would let Sansa see of her counsel, and said, "What?"
"T'es pointe."
D with his sword toward the archery butts. "There's a wind comes across the yard before noon that'll break arrows to the right if you don't keep your bow flat. Think you can outshoot me in that wind?" "I think you can't keep your bow flat," Bran said, and then flustered a little at his own impudence. He glanced at Robb, who smiled. "You can both make fools of yourselves," Robb allowed. "Father's busy with the king. Mother's in a temper. Better you not be underfoot." "Underfoot?" Arya echoed cheerfully. "That's where we live." They went to the archery ground. The sky was clear glass, the air still with the peculiar stillness that happens when everything is braced. The snow which had fallen 2 nights past lay in broken white sheets along the walls, pushed into ridges where feet and hooves had churned it. Bran took the bow Robb handed him and strung it, pleased that his fingers did not fumble. Theon's smile made a half-moon under his eyes. "You start," Theon said. "I'd be ashamed to beat you if I shot first." "You'll be ashamed anyway," Bran said. It was easier with Theon. You took their jibes as part of the weather. He took his stance, the bow pulling pleasantly against his shoulder, and drew. The first arrow flew with a lovely little shiver. It struck left of center but firm. He measured that sensation in his body as if trying to remember how to sing it. He shot again and again until he had a small cluster hardly larger than his hand. The wind did want to bite the arrows and pull them right. He could feel it at his throat, the way it wasn't quite the same in one breath as the next. He adjusted and then adjusted again, his body learning something it could not say. Theon stepped up with a swagger and pulled, letting the string go without letting the arrow travel. "Oh," he said, "I nearly forgot to loose. Did you see that?" "No one saw that, I hope." He flashed his grin at Sansa. She didn't trouble to smile back. Joffrey lingered at the edge of the yard with the Queen's hound close by, the great dog yawning around its teeth. The prince watched them with the dissatisfied attention of someone who has never made small, honest efforts and thus finds them suspicious. His hair shone too bright for the winter light. He did not speak with them. It sufficed that he was there and that the men came to heel a little tighter when he passed. Bran shot until his shoulder made complaints, then shot again because he did not want to stop at anything that looked like the beginning of failure. Theon shot well. Bran could not deny it. The wind flirted, Theon flirted back, and meant to make the day his. Yet when they counted up, Bran had more in the center ring, and Theon shrugged with good humor and a touch too much theatricality. "I suppose congratulations," Theon said. "You've grown a bit." "I'll grow more," Bran said. "I don't doubt it." Theon knuckled his shoulder gently and turned to greet Jory, who had returned with a message. Bran didn't catch the words. He watched the wolf instead, who had chosen a strip of sunlight and lay in it like a spilled puddle of fur. A girl of the Queen's company passed in a cloak lined with pale fur. The wolf opened one eye as if to mark her and went on being a wolf. By midday, the castle was a swirl of motion. Men came and went with letters, baskets, keys. A wagon's axle broke beside the brewhouse, and men stood around it offering advice like knucklebones tossed in a circle, while the axle lay on the stones like a sundered limb. The king was at his ease in Ned Stark's hall, which meant that none of the quiet workings of the place were allowed to be quiet, because laughter does something to the shape of a room that even the walls must answer. Cook sent up a venison stew so heavy with juniper berries that Bran could smell it from the yard, and for a time all the talk ran to whether the king would eat 2 bowls. Bran ate with Robb and Sansa and Arya, and, because Ned had been summoned again to the king, with Ser Roderick, whose beard caught droplets of broth like the thatch catches do, and with Maester Luwin, who folded himself into the company as smoothly as a note slipped into a book. Luwin watched the wolf sniffing around the table's legs with mild disapproval. "Wolves are not dogs," he said, as if reminding himself of a truth he had settled once and checked occasionally to see if it still held. "They do not belong in halls." "The hall belongs to Winterfell," Arya observed, "and he's part of Winterfell." "Some will argue that wolves belong to forests and halls belong to men," Luwin replied. "But perhaps we need not rehearse those arguments at table." He smiled to show that his words hadn't been meant to bite. "What have you learned today?" Bran thought about the question because with Luwin it was best to have something to hand besides pride. "Jory's weight rests in his hips when he moves," he offered. "And the wind through the archery ground is not straight. Is that learning?" "It may be the beginning of it," Luwin said. "It's not learning if you do not use it again." "I'll use it," Bran said. Robb wiped bread around the edge of his bowl. "Mother wants us to sup with Father and the King tonight," he told them. "If he's done with council by then. He wants to speak to us before the King leaves. He wants to tell us he's going south," Sansa said quietly, though her eyes were bright with a confluence of excitement and dread. "The Queen says the King has asked him to be the hand, and the hand rules when the King hunts, drinks, and laughs." Arya rolled her eyes. "The Queen says many things. The Queen's saying it makes it true enough for this purpose," Robb replied. "Father will go because the King asks it." The word south had become a lodestone inside Winterfell. Cups and looks and sentiments swung toward it. Bran felt it under his breastbone, a pull he didn't know whether to welcome or fight. He wanted to see the south. He wanted to see knights in their inn, umber and cities that were too big to count. He wanted to see all the things the books mentioned and more the books didn't. "You won't go," Arya told him as if he had spoken aloud. "You're a boy still, and Mother will keep you here because she keeps things. She's already kept me. Mother says my stitches are coming along," Sansa put in, which might have been true. "And if I go with Father," she added, and then fell abruptly silent. Her glance slid away to the window. She was thinking of something that made her throat move. "You'll show them," Arya said with affectionate spite. "You'll bring them your stitches, and they'll bring you a whole court in exchange." "Don't be cruel," Robb said. "We'd all like to go, and we can't all go. I'll have the castle to mind." "A fine castle to mind," Ser Roderick said with a bristled amiability. "One with broken axles and men who think more ale will mend them." "There's an old woman in the village," Luwin said, as if these two things were one. "Her chimney's fallen in. I'll send a mason this afternoon if Lord Stark doesn't require me." "Mikken can spare one," Robb agreed. He looked at Bran. "Come with me after we eat. there's petitions to hear. You might as well start learning that too. Bran chewed and swallowed and said, "All right." Later, while the sky kept on being clear with a doggedness that made Bran feel as if it were determined to prove some small point, he sat beside Robb at the foot of the high seat while the people of Winterfell came with their troubles like hens with eggs to set. The hall was cooler with most of the fires banked, the king and his people elsewhere. The wolves were restless this afternoon. Sansa had taken Lady away with her to sit with the queen and breathe the soft air of her smiles. Arya and her wolf had vanished into some lesser corner where Arya found her happiness. Robb's gray wolf sprawled at his feet, ears flickering at words he didn't care to parse. Bran saw a man with a cut on his cheek like an exclamation. The man wanted compensation for a pig stolen by a neighbor's boy. The neighbor's boy had tears crusted under his eyes and a set to his mouth that made Bran want to laugh and cuff him both at once. A woman with hands like knots asked for permission to cut trees from a copse at the edge of her holding. The woman's fear was all for the winter and not for any punishment they might give. Bran tried to sit still as the carved figure of a saint and found that he could not. His legs wanted to swing, and that annoyed him because he wasn't small anymore. He folded his hands as Maester Luwin had shown him when the shapes of letters were new and peered over them, trying to look judicious. Robb was careful. He had father's way of stopping and considering before speaking. He did not answer as a boy would, out of appetite or haste. He weighed. When he was silent too long, Theon shifted impatiently and offered an answer for him. But Robb only smiled and thanked him and did as he meant. Bran watched because it seemed suddenly that watching could turn into learning if one leaned hard enough in the right places. They were interrupted once by the arrival of a raven and the man who carried it. The bird ruffled and croaked. Bran felt the hairs lift along his arm. He turned his head. The wolf by his feet was awake without moving, eyes open a fraction. "A message from East," Luwin said when he had read it. Words turned neatly into numbers, then unpacked again. "A small one. A village beyond the Barrow Downs has seen a direwolf across the moor. They see their own shadows and call them wolves." Theon scoffed. "There are wolves," Bran said. His wolf bumped his knee once as if to remind him that not all wolves were stories. "There are," Luwin agreed. "But this one is large and moves as if unafraid." "Then it's a good sign," Robb said. "The hills are ours as long as wolves are." Luwin's mouth made a line that said both yes and be cautious. He set the note aside. "And the wheelwright in the village wants payment for repairing a lord's cart that broke his axle. He says the cart was overloaded and the lord cursed him in front of his son. He doesn't ask for coin, only acknowledgement that he's owed a kind word." Robb rubbed his jaw. "Give him that, and send the word. We've men who forget themselves among small folk when they wear more iron than they're used to. I'll remind them." Bran kept still, but he did not manage to fold his hunger for doing into a neat shape. He wanted to be out again in the cold. He wanted to climb the watchtower and stare at the edge of the world. He wanted to go to the first keep and find the place where the stone swallowed sound and learn why men set a guard there. He wanted to know what his father was agreeing to with the king. He wanted to be the sort of boy a man trusted with knowing. After the petitions, he escaped the hall with the wolf behind him, leaving Robb to argue with Mikken about the number of spearheads that could reasonably be forged in a week. He went by the outer yard and down an alley that was not meant as an alley but the space between the armory and a storehouse where snow drifted and stayed shaded. There, in the narrow strip between rough stone and piled barrels, he found old Nan. She had settled herself on a stool with her back to the wall and her shawl drawn up to her nose, and she was telling something to two little ones Bran did not know. Children from one of the outer houses pressed in with the crowd, maybe, or from a crofter's hut near the walls. Her voice was thin and strong at once. It cut the air like a reed pipe, and he came in with the skin of a thing he should not have skinned, because he thought if he wore it he would be something else, she was saying. And he ate and ate until the winter was inside him. He slept without closing his eyes and dreamed without falling asleep. "That's not a story," one of the children objected. "That's just words." "All stories are words until they find you," Old Nan said, unperturbed. Her eyes lifted and fixed on Bran with a mild, sharp welcome, like a needle held up to the light. "There you are, little lord." "I'm not little," Bran said. "No," Old Nan agreed. "You've been growing behind my back again, and that's a rude game. Come here and lend me the sight of your young eyes. These two are in need of a good ending to their fright." "I'm not frightened," the taller child said, though he made a fist in his sister's sleeve. "We're all frightened," Old Nan said, and patted his knuckles. "That's how we know where to put our hands. Sit, Bran. I'll tell the one about the king whose crown sprouted antlers and whose head grew so heavy his neck bent. And then I'll tell about your father killing a man who had never done a thing to him, because that's what men with duty must do. Then I'll tell about a boy who heard a crow call his name when no one else was there, because those are the things that can be told, and you're at the age for hearing." Bran cleansed his hands in the snow out of a habit that had more to do with calming himself than with any dirt on his fingers. He sat. The wolf lay at his side with his nose on Bran's boot. Old Nan tucked her shawl around her like a nest. Bran watched her hands and mouth and the space between words where something that was not quite breath and not quite thought slipped through. When she spoke of the king with antlers, she twisted her hands into the shape of horns. She made her voice heavy and then light. The two children leaned close as if they would climb inside her words. Bran wondered whether the king in the story was truly a king he knew and she had hidden him behind antlers to save his name from the cold. He wondered whether grown people always changed their words to keep off the bite of truth. He wondered what his father would make of Old Nan's explanation of duty, which was not the same as the one Maester Luwin offered when he spoke of laws. "Are there truly giants?" the girl asked when Old Nan paused. "No," the boy said firmly, to prove that he was older. "There are men with stories about giants," Old Nan said. "And sometimes the stories come down their beards into their bellies and make them fat with believing. Those are dangerous men even if they're small." The boy nodded as if the answer had matched exactly the shape of the question he'd wanted to ask. Old Nan's eyes went to Bran again. "And you, little lord, what do you want to know?" "I want to know why men bring crates to the first keep and post a guard there," Bran said before thinking about whether he ought to keep the thought under his tongue. Old Nan sniffed. "Because the oldest places in castles are always useful to people who want to do something no one else sees, and useful to rats, and useful to remembering. I never knew a keep so old it didn't like secrets more than bread. Be careful where you put your feet. There are stairs that go down instead of up even when your eyes tell you otherwise." Bran thought he could see that as a shape, as if the spiral stair could twist that way. He wanted very much to test it. He said instead, "I want to know if the king will make my father go with him." "He will ask," Old Nan said, "and your father will go with his mouth. His heart will stay. That is the trouble with hearts, how they cannot always follow. There. That is wisdom enough for a day with frost on the roofs." When the light began to slant toward afternoon, Bran went to the godswood. He slipped by a servant carrying chopped carrots and another carrying a bucket of clean rushes and a third with a basket of clothes pinned together by hope even more than by wooden pegs, and made his way where men did not go unless they had business with themselves. The wolf didn't hesitate. He trotted ahead, his body threading between tree trunks like a thought through a crowded room. The gods would belong to something deeper than Winterfell and didn't care for its rules. The air grew colder as Bran stepped under the branches. The snow's edge held a faint powder of ash from the kitchens and then lost that trace entirely. The weirwood in the center lifted its white limbs against the sky, and its face, the face carved there, its eyes red with sap, watched with a contained, patient attention, not friendly exactly and not unkind. Bran had been coming here all his life, and never had he known whether the face knew him. He always greeted it as if it did. He set his palm on the bark. The cold went through him like a clean knife. "They will go," he said, not sure whether he was reporting it or confessing it. "Father will go." The wolf circled the base of the tree and lay down where the roots rose, his body completing the lines the roots had already begun to draw. Bran looked up, then down again. There was a crow perched on a branch high above, black against the pale. Most crows were bold and noisy, their calls like a pair of stones knocked together. but this one had come without ceremony and watched without pretense. He had the queer feeling it was looking at him rather than merely looking around. He lifted a hand before he could tell himself not to, as if one could call crows like dogs. It spread its wings and dropped, then flapped away as if offended to find itself obeying. Bran laughed once under his breath, surprised by the warmth of it. "Bran," a voice said behind him, and he turned at once because the sound of his name in that place felt like something that could not be ignored. Jon stood at the edge of the clearing, his face bare and cold, his hair untidy as if he had decided to wear the wind as a hat. Ghost was with him, almost but not truly white against the snow, the eyes red. Jon squinted from the light, then stepped forward. "I thought you might be here," Jon said. "You always are when there's something you don't know where to put." Bran didn't pretend. "Will you go soon?" "Soon," Jon said. "Esto." Pet shrugged. The motion was a misdirection and Bran knew it. Jon learned to ward himself with shrugs as a man learns to use a shield. "Benjen leaves when the king does. I go with him. There's not much else for me to do here." "You could stay," Bran said. Not because he thought it would change the shape of the world, but because the desire was there and words wanted to be spoken when they were strong. Jon smiled, a small thing that made him look kind without making him look weaker. "I could," he said. "And then what? I'd be a man who stayed and watched a door I was not supposed to pass through. I'd wear that watching like a coat." "It would be a warm coat," Bran muttered. "Stay." Jon shook his head. "It would be heavy. The wall's a heavy coat too, but it's one meant to bear weight." He crouched beside Bran and set his hand on the roots a respectful distance from the carved face, not touching the same place Bran's hand had touched. "It's no small thing to belong somewhere," he added very quietly. "You belong here," Bran said. "I belong to Winterfell," Jon said, "but I do not belong in its halls. It is not the same, though it will keep me warm in the worst weather." Ghost sniffed at the roots and sat, a twin of Bran's wolf and not a twin. "I want to go south," Bran said. "Father won't take me. I want to see if it's true that the streets in the capital are as full as fields in harvest." Jon glanced at him sidelong. "And what will you do there?" "Climb the castle and see what the roofs think," Bran said, grinning. Jon huffed a soft laugh that warmed the air. "Then perhaps it is better you stay here. If you climb walls there, the guards will throw you in cells and you'll miss your supper." "They couldn't catch me," Bran said, "and I'll not fall," he didn't add. He didn't know why the thought came so cleanly, like a razor. Of course he wouldn't fall. The roofs were his. The idea of falling felt like a bad story told to frighten children to bed early. Jon's hand went absently to the back of his neck. "When I'm at the wall," he said, "I'll send you letters. I'll tell you what the world looks like from the top of it. You tell me what it looks like from the roofs here. Then we'll have two worlds between us." Bran nodded, and because he could not think of a thing to say that would make any of it sit right, he leaned his shoulder against Jon and let the pressure count as sense. They remained there until the cold began to bite properly. When they rose, Bran took one last glance at the face in the tree and thought, not for the first time, that it seemed sometimes to want to speak and find itself unable. He considered saying that aloud and decided that saying it would make it less true. He went back through the trees with Jon, the wolves flanking them like shadows that had decided to come along for the change. They parted at the edge of the yard. Jon turned toward the armory, where Benjen Stark's men were making ready, and Bran went to see if he could find Catelyn before the supper with the king. He found her in Father's solar with the door open, her needle moving in and out of cloth as if she were trying to sew a barrier strong enough to keep her husband from going. She set the needle down when he came and let him kiss her cheek. He smelled rosewater on her skin and the clean sharp of linen. "Have you been climbing?" she asked, as if she asked any question but that one. "I was in the kitchens," he said, and in the godswood he did not say. She would not count that as better than climbing. She looked past him for the wolf. The wolf stood patient in the passage like a thought that had remembered its place. "Keep him close tonight," she said, and then, catching herself, "If you must keep him anywhere, keep him where people are." There's too many strangers in Winterfell who do not know the customs here. I would not have them learn the hard way what it means to startle a wolf." "He's good," Bran said. "He won't bite anyone you don't want him to." "I'm sure," she said in the tone she used when she was not sure. She reached for him, smoothed the hair from his forehead. "Tonight," she said after a moment, and had to clear her throat, which was unlike her. "Tonight your father will say words to you and to Robb and to the girls. Stand straight. Remember them." "What if I don't like them?" Bran asked because he felt brave in that moment and because if he didn't say so now, he never would. She didn't chide him for it. She touched his cheek with the back of her fingers, as if making sure it was his. "There will be words you don't like," she said. "Do not let your face tell as much. The men from the south are watching everything now, and some of them do not wish us the ease they wish themselves. Keep your counsel and your temper, and sleep in your bed, not on a roof." He smiled a little miserably. "Are you angry with father?" "I am angry with the world," she said. "Your father is part of it." She smiled then, quick and crooked. "If he weren't, I'd have less to be angry about and less to love." Supper with the king went poorly and well, which is to say there was much laughter and much wine and talk that veered between coarse and careful. The king slapped men's backs and told stories that ended with roaring, and Cersei Lannister smiled with the precise edge of a knife and once said a thing so smoothly that Bran understood only much later that she had cut someone's string with it. Sansa sat very proper, and Arya knocked over her wine with her elbow at least once, and Robb answered when spoken to, which was not often, and answered well. Ned Stark's face was the face the men of Winterfell knew. There was a set to his jaw that said water could move him but stone could not. There was a moment when the king banged his cup and shouted and made Ned lift his own cup in answer, something heavy in it, but Bran was too far away to hear the words and the noise blurred them. He shifted in his seat and felt his impatience like an itch. Afterward, in the hall where the men of the king drank and caroused and a minstrel sang songs of places Bran had never seen and was now desperate to, he slipped away. He took the path that led toward the old First Keep because he'd been told not to and because something in him didn't yet know how to make himself obey those sorts of orders. The wolf came, lean and silent, his nose flicking. The guard at the base of the stair was a man Bran knew by sight. One of the queens, with his hair smoothed and his mouth in a line as if he were resisting the impulse to chew on something forbidding. He stood with his weight not quite committed to either foot, a stance a sword instructor would correct. Bran, who had learned to disappear when men spoke and not to be small when no one needed him to be, turned into the shadow under the arch and became another bit of Winterfell's stone. He could have gone up. He could have found a way. He had before. He stood instead and watched where the man looked and where he didn't. Another man came and murmured. The first one nodded. They switched places. The second leaned on his spear in a way that suggested he had been told the task was important but did not believe the words. He drew something from his pocket and examined it under the torch. A bit of tin, perhaps, a charm. He tucked it away and spat on the stone. He did not see the wolf, though the wolf stood 6 paces from him, made of patience. Bran felt that peculiar pleasure he always did when he learned the edges of other people's attention. If men were always missing things, he could live in the gaps. No one went up while he watched. No one came down. He waited until he felt silly and a little cold, and then waited still, stubbornness falling on him like a cloak he had been keeping dry for a better day. It did not change. Nothing. Then, as if answering the quiet in the stairwell, he heard a single thin sound from above like a nail dropped on stone. The guard started, but that was because Bran did. He made himself flatten into shadow. The man peered up the stair. He called something. He got an answer too soft for Bran to catch and settled again. Bran breathed out very slowly, his breath crossing the wolf's nose. The wolf's ear turned and then returned to its position. Bran could not climb now without becoming the thing the guard saw. He backed away step by step. He could have risked it for a better story to tell himself later, but some instinct older than sense told him this was not an adventure story. It was a different sort of story, the kind that dogged men's heels for years. He fled it. On the roof that night he did not climb. He lay in his bed like a boy not at war with himself. The wolf slept lightly in the corner of the room, making the little muffled grumble that said, "Mine." Bran dreamed, and his dream was full of trees taller than Winterfell's tallest tower, with bark like old men's skin, and crows that hopped along branches, then became ravens, then became questions with wings. He climbed in his dream and did not fall there either, only went higher until the air thinned and he could see the line where sky ended, which woke him because it was such a foolish notion. Morning told them with the crackled brilliance of sun on frost that the king meant to leave. He stood in the yard in his furs, laughter softer than last night but still loud, as men untied ropes and cinched straps, as the queen's brother swung into his saddle as if the motion pleased him at its edges as much as in its center. The queen wore white and looked like carved fat, which made Bran think of the kitchens and then feel a little disloyal and a little pleased with himself. Sansa wept quietly and tried to do it with grace. Arya did not weep. Catelyn stood straighter than usual, as if her spine were a spear someone had planted in the earth and forgotten. Ned Stark went to each of his children and put his hand on each head or shoulder in turn, saying words that made something settle and something else shift in the same breath. To Robb he said something Bran could not hear over the creak of leather, but that made Robb's mouth tighten and his chin lift. To Sansa he spoke with grave sweetness, and to Arya he spoke as to a small soldier with orders more important than she could yet know. When he came to Bran, he put his hands on Bran's shoulders and met his eyes, and for once his gaze was not looking at a son to see him but looking into Bran as if there were something there he had to take away with him. "You will learn the work of being a Stark," he said simply. "Your mother will teach you. Your brother will teach you. The walls will teach you. Stay with them and learn. Keep the scale in your head, and keep your hands out of men's quarrels unless they are your quarrels. Use what you learn." Bran nodded. He wanted to ask if he might go south when he was older, but the words would be too sour now, and he did not want to eat his goodbye and find it salt. "Yes," he said, "and keep your feet on the ground," Ned added, and the corner of his mouth moved. It was the tiniest admission that he knew where Bran liked to put his feet. Bran color crept up his throat. He nodded again. Then it was done the way large things are done. There is noise, and then there is movement, and then the place where the large thing had been is empty and no longer the same place. The king's company wound out like a bright snake through the gate. The queen's brother rode near the front where men could see him. Tyrion Lannister, much smaller than his brother, walked at his pony's head for a time and then, with the air of someone who had reminded the world of his existence and been satisfied with its glance, swung into the saddle. He did not look back. Jon went with Benjen Stark and the men of the Night's Watch. Bran watched him ride away, Ghost making a white shape in the shadows for a moment and then nothing, and expected the ache in his chest to lessen as the shape in the gate shrank and vanished. It did not. Winterfell's stillness afterward felt like the quiet in the hall after a song. That heavy moment when the last note hangs and the room must decide what to be next. For a day the servants moved carefully, as if the world would take offense at too much clatter. Catelyn went about her business with a purposeful cheer that did not fool anyone. Robb stretched like a cat who has been given the job of dog. Bran climbed then, in the late afternoon, when the sun had warmed the roofs just enough to make him forgive them their slipperiness and himself his caution. The wolf came with him and sat upon the great keep's parapet like a figure carved in winter. Bran looked out on Winterfell and beyond it to the trees and the plains that rolled away toward other men's ideas of the world. There were thin lines where roads had been and would be. There were small black dots like seeds where people moved, and he imagined them moving and went dizzy for a second with the thought of all the little lives. His fingers found the cold stone and gripped it. The wolf sneezed once and blinked his gold eyes and put his chin on his paws. Bran laughed, then stopped at a sudden flicker at the edge of his sight. A bird, he thought, but when he turned it was only a flag moving that had somehow been still at his first glance. Words came in the days that followed. Ravens brought messages like stones thrown into still water. Robb opened some and took the weight of them into his hands. Catelyn opened others and took the bite into her mouth without showing it. There came word that the king had reached the first night's hold without incident. There came word that a storm had broken the day after and the king had hunted anyway. There came something else that Caitlin showed only to Rob and then, after looking at Bran for a very long moment, to him. "It seems your father was right to be cautious," she said, the paper crisp between her fingers. "Every time he treads on their floors, he leaves his prints, and someone thinks to sweep them away." Bran did not know what to do with that, so he set it aside like a bolt of cloth and watched to see what garment it might become. He went to the village with Rob to see the chimney repaired. The mason, called Will, met them at the door with his shoulders hunched against the cold, his hat pulled low. The house's owner was a woman with 3 children and a husband who had gone to the hunting and not come back with anything but apologies. Bran watched Will shake his head at the stones and make a plan out loud. He watched Rob listen and decide. He looked at the children while they were not looking at him. One had a smear of soot across his ear as if the chimney had kissed him. The other 2 stared at the wolf until he stared back, and they remembered to be embarrassed by their curiosity. "You can teach me to build chimneys?" Bran asked Will when the man had finished explaining to Rob why it would cost 2 days and 3 men. "I can teach you why you shouldn't try to build one on your own," Will said, with the comfortable insolence craftsmen show their lords when they know that their knowledge is a license as good as any. "Come when we set it. You'll see how it holds its breath." "I'll come," Bran said. On the way back to the castle, a light snow began to fall. It lay on Bran's eyelashes and melted into his eyes and made the world swim then sharpen. He thought of Jon on the King's Road and whether the snow there would be heavier or lighter, and whether Ghost trod as quietly in the south as he did in Winterfell, and whether there was a place between south and north where the air hesitated and couldn't decide which it wanted to be. At night, in the long quiet after the lamps were put out, he dreamed of the stair in the first keep. In his dream, he began at the top and descended, which is not the way to dream of stairs if you fear them. He went down past landings that were not there in waking, where doors stood ajar and showed rooms that contained things that were both familiar and wrong. His mother sewing, but with a thread made of ice. His father polishing a sword that had no edge. Jon asleep with his eyes open. Rob laughing and no sound. He woke with his heart racing and the wolf's breath on his hand, steady and dog-warm, and lay very still until he could breathe again like a boy and not a hunted thing. The morning after that, Tyrion Lannister returned for a day on his way south from the Wall. He looked like a man who had gathered dry, cold air in his lungs for sport and carried back a bit of it to share. He dismounted in the yard and made a show of being less tired than he was. Bran saw the show and liked him better for it. Tyrion spoke with Caitlin and then with Robb, and then he found Bran by the well where the water steamed a little. "You're the climber," Tyrion said conversationally. "I can tell by the way you stand. All the muscles ready for going up instead of going forward." "I am," Bran said, because it was something he was and not something given him. He did not apologize for it in front of this man. Tyrion nodded, as if Bran had solved a small puzzle for him. "And if you had no roofs, you would climb trees," he went on. He peered at the wolf. "And if you had no wolves, you would teach dogs to be wolves." "I could," Bran said, amused in spite of himself. Tyrion's smile was quick. He pulled a folded scrap from his glove. "I wrote this down on a cold night when my hands needed something to do that was not rubbing them together," he said. "It's a notion for a saddle, no, not as you think, not the sort made to keep a boy in place when he is hurt. The other kind. The kind that lets a rider use his knees and not his hands so he can do more foolish things while climbing on a horse. It would let you stand on his back to pluck apples, which I'm told is a necessary skill in Winterfell as there are no apples within 50 leagues. Bran took the rough drawing and saw the shape of it. A leather contrivance of straps that would let a rider rise and balance. He could see how to cinch it and where to take care with knot and slip. "You drew this for yourself?" he asked, then flushed because he heard the insult in it and could not catch it back. "I drew it to consider what a boy would need who loves to climb and cannot help it, and who, if the gods give him no towers for a season, will find other heights," Tyrion said mildly. "If I cannot see you ride it, someone will. You can throw it away if it's foolish. Most of my ideas go into the fire where they heat a room if they do nothing else." Bran looked at the paper and saw, with a sudden clarity that made his skin prickle, himself on a horse's back with the world unfurling under him like a map He had never known how to read when he had only the roofs. The wolf sniffed the parchment and sneezed. "I'll keep it," he said, then remembered to bow a little. "Thank you. Don't thank me until you've fallen off it 6 times and gotten back on," Tyrion said, with a curiously earnest look. "Then you may thank me and curse me both." He rested a hand on the rim of the well. "The wall is very tall," he said, as if this were surprising news. "Do not ask someone who has never seen it if it is tall. Ask someone with short legs who has climbed it. I send you that wisdom without additional charge." He looked up at the sky. "And I will send your regards to your brother if I see him again." He went north with eyes like a man who has varnished something inside to keep it from weathering. "If you don't understand that yet, you will." Bran thought he did, or at least he thought the shape of the words would let him understand later. He tucked the drawing inside his jerkin as if it were something that could be stolen. After the dwarf left, Winterfell settled into a pattern. Patterns were a kind of shelter. The guard changed at sensible times, and there were no more crates taken to the first keep, though men still kept watch there in pairs. Robb set drills and practiced with gray steel that sang when it cut the air. Catelyn counted stores and found them both sufficient and insufficient, as one does when imagining winter. Maester Luwin taught Bran the accounts. He had Bran copy a page of tallies until his hand cramped, and then told him to stop and shake it out and then write again, because men needed to learn that discomfort wasn't the same as injury. Bran scowled and wrote. At dusk, Bran went to the kennels and let the wolf smell the dogs and assert himself and then get bored with the work and lie down. He went to the town and stood at the door of the alehouse and listened to the men talk about weather and women and the way a horse looked when you thought it was sound and then one day it wasn't. He went to Micken's forge and asked too many questions and watched the iron move as if it were alive when it was hot. He went to the barracks and asked Jory about the time he had been south and what the roads had smelled like there. He learned to read the weather in the way the geese lifted by the pond near the south gate. He stood on roofs and imagined falling and did not do it. He learned the names of 3 men he had previously known only by the backs of their heads. He learned that everything he could learn sat in front of him on the table, prosaic and patient. And once, because questions behave like wolves, returning to gnaw at the bone until it is clean or splintered. He went again to the first keep after the guard had been changed and sat in the cold shadow at the foot of the stair. He waited until his breath made a fog in the air and the fog went thin and still he waited. And then he heard again, as he had before, something from above. A small sound like a cat's footfall and then nothing, and then a whisper not of voice but of stone, which is to say the kind of sound castles make when they are thinking. He did not climb. He had begun to understand what kind of boy he wanted to be and which of his hungers would serve that boy. He went away with the wolf following, a dim shape whose presence had become, in a way, a thought he didn't need to think anymore, accompanied. Letters came. Once a raven from King's Landing brought news wrapped in words that had humped their shoulders to resist the shape of a story and had been made to fit anyway. Robb read and swore softly. He showed Catelyn, who breathed in as if through her teeth. Neither told Bran all, and he hated that and understood it and hated his understanding. "Your father," Catelyn said, her fingers tight around the parchment, "is doing the difficult thing in a place where men love the easier ones. It will not make him beloved. Will it make him safe?" Bran asked. She looked at him in a way she had not before, as if measuring whether his question deserved an answer that was not cloth over a bowl. "Nothing makes a man safe," she said, "but honor helps him sleep, and friends help him stand. Does father have friends there?" Bran pressed. "Some," she said, "and some men who call themselves friends but are watching their reflections in his eyes." She let out a breath. "Go on. Run a lap of the yard and pretend it will make the world better." "It makes me better," Bran said and ran. In the running and the writing, in the small decisions about chimneys and fields, in the banter with Theon and the games with Arya and the careful talk with Sansa when she wanted to speak of lace and Joffrey and futures as if they were baskets that could be filled to order, winter inched closer without arriving. There were mornings when the frost was so thick it made the stones soft underfoot. Not so that you would slip, but so that you felt you could. There were afternoons when the sun had real warmth enough to make steam from the pools thick as a veil. The wolves grew. Rob's gray wolf took to bounding ahead and then turning to invite pursuit with a laugh in his mouth. Arya's wolf shadowed her and learned mischief she had not known until she taught it. Sansa's lady moved with a grace that said she had perfected the art of belonging anywhere and thus never needed to prove it. Rickon's wolf was a mess, a lovely, dangerous mess. He carried sticks and then forgot them. Bran's wolf was quiet and intent. He slept with his long nose on Bran's boot sometimes and sometimes not. He watched snow fall as if the snow were a pattern that told him something he might later need. Bran had the saddle made after a council too long by half. Mikken grumbled and then, when presented with Tyrion's drawing, grumbled differently and then called Will and another man in and commanded them to cease all work on spearheads because it was time to do something improper to leather. The saddle grew like an idea made flesh, with straps that slid through rings, with buckles that held and would not betray, with a way of riding that let him rise and set while the horse moved beneath him like a river you learn not by thinking about water but by waiting until your calves ache. The first time he tried it, he fell on his feet and then his knees and then his backside, in that order. The second time he fell on his shoulder. The third time he fell into a snow drift so soft it did not feel like falling. The fourth time he did not fall. He rode standing, the wolf galloping beside him, and felt something inside him open like a hand that had been clenched too long and finally remembered how to be a hand. He whooped and then bit the sound in half because he did not want to be seen as the sort of boy who whooped, and whooping is a hard habit to break once acquired. He rode until his thighs quivered and then rode again the next day. He rode to the pond near the south gate and stood while his horse made breath like steam engines. He rode to the outer fields and waved at the children tending sticks in the furrows as if the sticks were sheep. He rode to the edge of the forest where the trees gathered in their own council and felt their old regard follow him back. Once, late on an afternoon that had become evening while pretending not to, he went with Robb as far as the ridge beyond the village, where you could see the road snaking away south. They dismounted and stood together, the wolves milling. "Do you think Father is at ease?" Bran asked finally, when the afternoon had made him mild and more honest than usual. "No," Robb said without hesitation. "But we were never promised ease." "What were we promised?" Bran asked. "Work," Robb said, "and each other when we can manage it." "And when we cannot manage it?" Bran said, because the question had come, unwelcome but insistent. Robb's jaw set in a way that reminded Bran suddenly of the look his father had given him on the day the king left, the look that had peered into him as if to take something. "Then we do our part anyway," Robb said, and bent to check the girth on his horse because checking things is sometimes a way to end a conversation without disrespect. Snow came in a proper storm the week after, making the castle like a man hunched in a cloak with his face buried. The wind worried at the windows and whined down corridors like an old ghost finding new doors. Bran went out in it without his mother's permission and felt its teeth on his cheek and his ears and went back in with his skin awake. The wolf shook himself and made snow fly in an arc Mikken cursed because the temper of steel changes with the weather, and he had to take that into account, and his bones ached besides. Luwin set extra boys to clearing the roofs, and Bran found himself conscripted into that thinking labor, plotting where the weight of snow would press and need to be coaxed off lest it press too long and do harm. Another raven brought another message that made Catelyn lift one hand toward the fire and pause there, warm hands, cold hands, as if considering whether to thrust it in. She handed it to Robb. He read and read again, as if reading twice turned most words into new ones. He did not show it to Bran, but that night Bran heard the cadence of a different kind of quiet in the hall where his mother and Robb spoke. It was a quiet that said, "We will decide something and it will make us other than we are right now." He slept badly that night. He dreamed of being on a roof and hearing his name called and not turning, and in the morning he was tired in the way that feels like your bones do not fit their sleeves. He went through the day as if waiting. When evening came, he went to the crypts not because he had reason to but because the old stones were good at letting a boy's heart slow enough to hear itself without trying. He carried a lamp. The wolves came only as far as the first passage and then sat, unwilling to go deeper, their bodies making the shapes of refusal with such clarity that Bran smiled despite himself. The crypts breathed cool air. The faces carved there were not all kind and not all forbidding. They were themselves, which is what the dead have that the living sometimes cannot quite manage. Bran walked between them and greeted them by name where he knew it and by title where he did not. A courtesy he was learning had weight even when no one saw it paid. He reached the end of one row and turned and saw, by surprise, that Rickon had followed after him without the wolves and stood there with his thumb in his mouth and his hair wild, wearing his night shirt and no shoes. The cold kissed his toes red. "You shouldn't," Bran said automatically. Rickon slid his thumb out. "You shouldn't," he returned with equal wisdom. "Mother will skin both of us," Bran said, and meant it as a caution but could not keep the grin out of his voice. He knelt and lifted Rickon and tucked him under his cloak and carried him back up, the lamp swinging and making the carved faces slide past them as if the dead moved after all. The wolves whined and backed away from the lee. GHT until they could go ahead of it. Back in the hall, with the fire thick and the smell of onions sweet in the air, Catelyn stood as if she were a pillar and looked at them both. Bran set Rickon down and arranged himself in awkward apologetic. We went to speak to the statues," he said, which was nearly true and nearly respectable. "You went to defy me," Catelyn said, and then, after a moment, "I wish your father were here, and I am a fool for wishing it because when he is here I wish him gone to do the duty that calls him." She turned her face to the fire and sighed, and then smiled at Bran with will rather than ease. "Wash and sleep," she said. "I will forgive you if you wake having learned from it." Rickon burrowed into his blankets that night as if burrowing into the earth. Bran lay awake and listened to the wind and thought about the weight of secrets in old keeps and the weight of words in even older halls, and the way the world changed every time someone decided to be brave or not be. He thought of the King's company moving south, and of Jon with his shoulders set against a future he had chosen, and of his father in halls where the floors had cracks you must not put your foot in. He thought of the wolf's breath and how it steadied him. In the week that followed, more letters came. One day, one came that made Robb call for Ser Roderick with a voice that cut the air like metal, and made Catelyn take both of her son's wrists and hold them as if through them she could keep the rest of him from flying apart. Bran saw none of those words with his eyes. He saw them with his family's bodies, and that told him enough to know that a little piece of Winterfell had shifted. That evening, when the kitchen fires burned low and Chael's breath smoked in the cold, the Ravenmaster brought a note folded small. It bore no seal. It had the look of a thing that had been written in haste and prejudice. Luwin read it and said nothing and handed it to Catelyn. Catelyn read it, and then she set her hand very gently on the table to steady the world, because the world didn't know how to be steady by itself. She looked at her sons and smiled, a thing made with great care. "What is it?" Bran asked, because he had found that sometimes you must ask even when you will not be answered. "Your father is well," she said, "and the city is not." She touched the note with a finger, and for an instant her face was very young and very old both, like the face of a tree that has made it through another winter. "We will have to be clever, and we will have to be better than we were yesterday. That is all this says." Bran swallowed. He wished himself taller. He wished the roofs of Winterfell were towers that could see the south, so that he could climb them and give his father directions from a safe, cold distance. He wished his wolf could carry a message in his mouth and know where to go with it. That night he took his wolf to the Godswood and lay on his back in the snow and looked up through branches that were black and spare and ready. The stars pricked the heavens as if they were sewing themselves together. The breath of the wolf rose and fell beside him, the rhythm his own breath took on without trying. He thought of the raven in the branches and of the way the weirwood's face never changed and always did, and he thought of the feeling of his father's hands on his shoulders and the thing those hands had tried to give him. He slept there a little, with the snow making a felt beneath him and above him and the cold teaching his body to be a better house for his own fire. In his sleep he dreamed again of a stair that could go down and up at the same time, and of men carrying crates that contained nothing but promises, and of a crow that pecked at his palm and shouted at him to open it and let the seed of a word be planted there. He woke before dawn with the sky not yet decided. He went back to his bed and slept an hour and woke to the first cries of the yard, and rose to the day because all that could be done was to meet it where it stood. He dressed, he ate, he listened, he learned, he climbed only a little, he rode. He fell once and laughed and swore and got back on. He went to the hall. He stood beside Robb. He watched their mother at the head of the table like a ship's figurehead leading the hull through rough water. He took on a small duty and both failed it and then did it better. By and by the first keep loosened its jaws. The Queen's men moved away from it with the same feigned nonchalance with which they had taken it, as if it were a cask of their wine they had borrowed and now returned. Bran did not go in. The wolf went and sniffed at the base of the stair and sneezed and looked at Bran and looked at the stair and then looked away. Bran considered ignoring that counsel and did not. There are kinds of courage that are only stubbornness in disguise, and he was beginning to know them when he saw them. He did not care to wear them in that particular shape. When the next raven came, Luwin read it and did not call for any man loudly at all. He went to Catelyn with his head inclined as a servant might go to his lady, and she looked up from her stitching as if she had expected the bird and knew the weight of it by the gust of air it made with its wings. She took the note. She read it. She put it down. She folded her hands on the table with her left thumb over her right, which was not the way she usually folded them. "We will send men to watch the King's Road," she said, not looking at her sons. "We will make the village stores more ample. We will give the men rest from their drills and then take it back twice as hard." His father, Robb began and then stopped. He did not finish the question, which was wise because there was no answer he could ask for that would change the shape of what they had to do next. Bran felt the shape of that too. He thought of the roofs of Winterfell and of all the roofs he had not yet climbed and would. He thought of the way knowing a thing does not change it but lets you set your feet differently when you meet it. He put his hand on his wolf's neck, feeling the bristle and warmth there, the contained wildness that had chosen him. "I'm here," he said, aloud or to himself, he could not tell. It was a promise and a declaration both, and a piece of the day's work. The wolf snorted, accepting or not caring. The fire burned. The walls listened. Outside, in the slow-crawling winter, the world gathered itself for something it had not named aloud. Bran went to the roof before night fell and stood a long time in the late light, the edge of the world sharp as a blade, and watched until the first star pricked the sky like a question. He asked no more of the day than it had already given him. He would ask again tomorrow. He was becoming the kind of boy who could,